So what I want to explore with you is something I've been aware of for a while. I think sometimes in Holocaust education there is an elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is the Church's variously understood and contested role during those years of the Holocaust and prior to that in the anti-Semitism that created a climate in which Naziology could find expression. So some of this will be contentious, and I want to open up a number of things, I hope to complicate your thinking rather than anything else. So bear with me, and I will frequently interrupt you when you're getting into something that's interesting to move on to something else, because I want to cover quite a lot of ground. So with all that said, let's move on. So my question really is, what role did the Church play? What role did Catholics play? I don't think they're necessarily the same thing. And I want to argue that Catholics were bystanders, collaborators, resistors, liberators, martyrs, victims, rescuers, and perpetrators. Other victim groups of the Nazis. And this is not to deny their importance and the horrific and indescribable persecution of them, but in order to be true, I think, to the Holocaust and to the Jewish community, it's important to put some parameters around that, and we could have a similar discussion about other groups as well. So whilst there isn't an official definition of the Holocaust, there are many, and this really just picks up on what I'm saying, that we also recognise, of course, there are many other millions of victims in other groups. So I'm going to introduce you first of all to Gabriella Keenagan. The Holocaust Educational Trust, which a number of you are probably familiar with and maybe use some of their resources or have been on their training, and if not, I would encourage you to do so, has a very, I think, well-considered approach to pedagogy, and at the centre of that is humanising all of those involved, with a particular emphasis on humanising, rehumanising, perhaps to some extent, victims. So we don't use horrific representations, images, etc. We think more about the person and how might they and their families like them to be considered, which isn't to deny the suffering. Gabriella Keenagan is a very wonderful lady that I've been privileged to get to know and whose company I enjoy immensely. She's 96, she's a survivor of the Holocaust, and she shares her memories of a teenage refugee. And I'm going to use clips of about probably a minute or two from her a few times, because I think she gives us a very interesting lens through which to look at Holocaust in a Catholic context, and perhaps to help us not to other so much some of those involved. So if you bear with me, I'll just switch to that recording. This is the longest clip because it sort of contextualises her. And this is a talk she gave for us at St Mary's for Holocaust Memorial Day.
Of a teenage refugee, but obviously I've got to give you a little bit of background before I became a refugee, why I became a refugee, and this is the important part, of course. I was born to a Christian mother and a Jewish father, and on that picture you can see my mother and father. And shortly after my birth, we went to live in Berlin because my father had business there. And that particular picture was taken in Berlin. I don't know, we didn't stay too many years in Berlin because my parents wanted me to go to school in Vienna. So I would say that, and at that time, school age in Vienna, we started school at 6 years old. So I would say that possibly we came back to Vienna in 1932. And I vaguely remember that there was a little bit of a problem in Vienna a year or two after I was about 8. Later on I heard that the Nazis had tried to enter Austria. It was obviously in 1934, a year after Hitler came to power. And the Nazis had tried to enter Austria. Some managed to get as far as Vienna, and at that time the Austrian Chancellor was assassinated by them. And there was a little bit of unrest in the city. And I just vaguely remember that, because we heard a bit of shooting and, it was quite unpleasant. But it passed over because I believe that the Austrian border people managed to get them back over the border into Germany. Obviously, Hitler had it in mind that he wanted Austria to be part of the German Empire. He was empire building, and he wanted Austria to be part of that. So I started school. Can't remember very much about that. I went to a small convent school, and my mother and father lived in Leopoldstadt, which is the second district of Vienna, and is the Jewish quarter. And as far as I know, I was quite a happy child until 1935. And then my mother took ill, and sadly, I suppose they didn't have the medication that they have today. She died of pneumonia, and that was very sad. She was just 28 years old, a very lovely lady, and it was very sad for me to lose my mum at the tender age of 8.5. I was only, a very young child. But my grandmother decided that she would become my guardian, and so I changed school, and I went to another convent school nearer to.
What does that suggest to you, that timeline, by the time you get to the end of it? This is anti-Jewish legislation in Germany, not in Austria, but there's similar things happen there a little bit later. What's this suggest to you about the experiences of people like Gabriella?
Well, they're sort of dehumanised, really.
Yeah, they're sort of.
They're not allowed to have all the rights that everybody else has, and that makes them poorer, smellier, and less able to integrate society anyway.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
I suppose it happened very gradually, so any one little thing at the time didn't seem massive, but when you take it collectively, it's the complete dehumanisation.
Thank you. Anything from over this way, this end?
They just seem to be slowly taking away, at the beginning, taking away the joy. Like they're not allowed members of sports clubs. Then they're losing their bicycles and their radios. Then the children aren't allowed to play with other children. So they're taking away joy in life. They're creating they're very much othering them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this is an activity I've done with year 5 and 6, up to 6th form. And it looks perhaps very simplistic, and in some ways it's oversimplifying. But it's giving us, I think, a sense of that sense of isolation, of the future being taken away as well as the present. And it's a helpful context sometimes within which to engage young people thinking about the experiences of individuals, not large numbers of people. Gabrielle is speaking to us during that period, and she's beginning to experience some of those things. So let's just hear just a minute more from her.
State of Vienna, and if you look at the population at the side of the road. People were giving the Heil Hitler sign, and people were cheering and clapping and waving to the troops. So, in actual fact, the ordinary people of Austria welcomed the arrival of Hitler. The reason for that is that Hitler had, certainly from the time, remember this is 1938, and he came to power in 1933 in Germany. And in the 5 years that he was in power in Germany, he had improved the economy of Germany tremendously.
And those ordinary people would have been, to a quite a large proportion, Catholic. The countries in which this took place would have had large church-attending Catholic populations, and they would have been going back generations. And I think that's something we can't avoid, and it raises lots of questions for us. So what's the sort of background to some of this, perhaps that's relevant to us if we're engaging in Holocaust education in Catholic schools? So in 2014, Pope Francis goes to Yad Vashem, the Israeli memorial for Holocaust victims, and that's a very symbolic gesture, I think, and it's certainly a long way from some of what has happened in the past in terms of papal approaches to Jewish people and to anti-Semitism and Holocaust. This is interesting, and I'm not going to read it to you, but it's an unpublished letter from the Vatican to the Church in the States, asking them to take care of non-Aryan Catholics. Gabriella is a Mischling. Her mum is Catholic. She uses Christians in her talks, but she's Catholic and she belongs to a parish up in the northeast of England. Technically, therefore, within Judaism, she wouldn't be regarded as a Jew because it's passed through the mother. So she's a Mischling and she's in danger for having a Jewish father and, of course, grandparents. But she's not of Aryan descent. She's Catholic, but she actually experiences the Holocaust as a Jew without really being conscious of that herself as part of her identity, which is another level of complexity. So let's have a look at these. Has anyone seen this photograph before? Yeah? Would you mind being not giving us the answer till somebody else
I
does
can't
have
remember
seen
when
it?
I've just
Okay.
I've seen it before. I've already.
So there is a clue because there's obviously a logo for Het in the corner, but anybody like to, well, with the person next to you, deconstruct this picture, read it, and tell us who you think these people are and where they are and what are they doing. Who are they, what they're doing?
Are we ready? No.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to?
Yeah, so I'm thinking that it's possibly Jewish children that have been sent and kept for photographs to send out to make people think that it's the cover story.
That's a very appropriate answer, but it's not correct. But why would you say that?
Well, because it happened and we knew that happened. So quite a possibility of looking at eating ice creams, playing music, looking like it's happy times.
Thank you. Another suggestion from anyone? Mr. Riley, you look as if you're about to tell us. Thank you for volunteering, Tom.
Well, we were struggling really. We thought, is it a choir, is it a day out? Who they are, don't know. Is it
What age would you say?
16, 17, 18-year-olds?
They are between 18 and 22, actually, so nearly right, yeah, good.
Okay.
The era?
1930s?
Mid-1930s, mid to late.
hairstyles suggest around that period, don't they? And we're doing this topic so it's likely we're in that era. We bring to this already, you're looking through various lenses of your prior knowledge, your cultural experience, your knowledge perhaps of fashion. So we always come, you know, with all that to something. They are actually young women who work in SS Helfrinen, doing the administrative work at Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp. And the man in the middle is their boss, he's an assistant commandant, and they're on a works outing to a spa in Poland, which is around 10 kilometres or so from Birkenau. Do you then see that any differently, that picture?
Well, the reality is, those people are still people.
Thank you.
Sadly, even if their willingness to do work, which many of us would find abhorrent, they probably just see it as a job, and they're just enjoying their youth.
Day out. Eating blueberries, and having a sing-song. They are not probably German nationals, they're probably from Eastern European countries, as many of the Nazi forces were, and they're perhaps joined up expecting a different placement, probably not expecting to be posted there. I think if I saw them sitting on the wall in Market Harbour where I live, I would walk past them quite happily because they don't look as though they would harm me. They are ordinary human beings. They may have been involved in monstrous things, but they are not monsters themselves. They made choices, sometimes very minor choices, sometimes much more dramatic. They are somebody's daughters, sisters, cousins, schoolmates, aren't they? They are
But the fact
people.
is, quite a few of them were, I mean, if they were involved in it, they were allowed to refuse. They were allowed to refuse placements. Like the ATCRE and the men who went around just
Yeah.
shooting before them, they were actually allowed to say, I don't want to do this.
No, and they would be moved to other duties. But the point really is that, you know, whatever the role people played, we need to be conscious of the fact that they were ordinary people. And of course, a good number of these would be Catholics. They might be Eastern Rite Catholics, they might be Roman Catholics, but they would represent the population of the time. So let's move to what was really a dramatic statement. I'm going to give you a copy of this. I still use paper because I quite like it, to take with you when you leave. They are 2 sheets and I'll leave them there for you to take, but we won't read it now. This is, I think, one of the most important documents, really, probably, where the Catholic Church is officially, if you like, acknowledging the unspeakable horrors and the need for this not to be forgotten. The fact that the Shoah took place in Europe, in countries of long-standing Christian civilization, raises the question of the relation between the Nazi persecution and the attitudes of Christians towards the Jews. It's not a document that's not criticised because it doesn't perhaps go as far as taking responsibility for anti-Semitism prior to this period, but it's a very significant document in the context of critiques of Pius XII perhaps being silent, you know, and of other, sometimes very anti-Semitic statements during history over the period. I'm not going, there's 4 slides now that are quite dense. I know you're not going to read them at the moment, but you will be able to have the slides, and I've put them on because I think the dates are interesting. You know, from 200 CE we've got examples here of anti-Semitism and massacres, expulsions of Jews that went on for about 800 years from different places, and persecution. And expulsion even from the Papal States in the 16th century. So we can't ignore that background, neither can we ignore the blood libel charges, the charges of ritual murder that accuse Jews of killing Christ, the Christ killers. I usually proclaim the Passion in my church on Good Friday, and every year I struggle with the role it gives to Jews in Jesus' death, which I think it don't fully acknowledge probably Roman power of the time and authority. And I really struggle with that when I read the Passion. And it kind of hangs around. So that's background that, there are many more examples that we can't ignore. And I'm just going to go back to Gabriella for a moment.
The troops moving into Vienna. However, they did. And life for me then changed completely because Hitler decided that nuns, I was in a convent boarding school, nuns could no longer teach children. The boarders could stay in the building with nuns, but we would have to go to schools elsewhere. And the local authority took charge of dividing us and telling us which schools we had to go to. They came to the convent, and I remember we were all in a big hall and waiting to hear our names called out. And suddenly I realized that everybody was at one side, and I was left on the other side, completely on my own. And I couldn't understand that. And then someone from the local authority came across to me and said, "I'm sorry, but you can't go to the same school as your friends. You'll have to go to another school." And I did ask the reason why. I said, "Why must I go to another school?" Well, the answer was, "Your father is a Jew." And this is the first time that I actually became aware that my father was Jewish. I had no idea about that at all. I couldn't really understand it. I couldn't understand why I should have to go to a different school, but that's what happened. And one of the nuns was given a little yellow star, the yellow star of David, and it had to be sewn into the lapel of the coat which I wore to go backwards and forwards to school. The first time I was taken there and introduced to the head teacher, etc. And then after that, it wasn't, the school was quite close to the convent, so I used to have to make my own way back and forth.
What's that nun doing? Sewing a yellow star on that child's clothes. Perhaps something for thought, really, and probably a good talking point in class. I've put a few links in here for you that you might be interested in using, so I won't comment on them. But I'm going to move to another activity that I would often do in secondary, which is looking at dilemmas, choices, responses to the Holocaust. And again, we're not going to do this in full, but I'm just going to share these with you and suggest that you might work with the people behind you. And what I'm asking you to do is just take one or two cards and see if you can make a decision about whether this story, well, these are historically true, but they're snippets, but does this describe the actions of a bystander, a perpetrator, or a resistor? Someone resisting what's going on, someone perpetrating, or someone... Would somebody have an example of a perpetrator on one of those cards? I mean, something you think describes the actions of a perpetrator. Thank you.
Yeah, just taking over a shop which was formerly run by a Jewish owner before it became illegal for Jews to own businesses.
Perpetrator. Yeah. Could there be another interpretation of that?
We were struggling with something quite similar, moving into a house formerly owned by a Jewish family, because they've not moved the family out, but then, so you would come up with the idea of saying perhaps we need another category of enabler.
Or have they given them money to enable them to, you know, to escape? It's much more complex than these. These are very bald details, but I think they just get us thinking about the complexities. An example of a bystander from anybody, please? Thanks.
Watching from the other side of the street as a Jewish shopkeeper cleans up smashed glass from his window the morning after Kristallnacht.
So at what point does a bystander become a perpetrator? It's a complex question we can't go into now. And a resistor.
A police reservist deciding not to take part in the mass shooting of Jews.
So, wouldn't be relieved of his duties completely. He'd have his duties changed and he would still be part of that process, but he wouldn't be doing that in particular. And it is a fallacy to say that if somebody did refuse to do that, they would lose their lives, because there are no records of that happening. But it's something that people will often talk about.
Didn't lose their lives, they didn't even get prosecuted.
Well, I think that the whole investigation of war crimes and everything else is another matter to go into, but people were on trial for involvement in a number of ways, I think we'd have to say. One of the things I would do with this is, with certainly at an upper school end, I'd be looking also at how these actions are passive or active. I might look at, whether they're actually positive or negative action. Is it an omission or is it an act of commission? And that kind of thing. And of course this raises the question, so what do non-Jews do? We're very good, I think, in the church giving the label non to lots of people. I do some research with non-Catholic teachers in Catholic schools and I use the language because I can't find any other. But actually, I'm not a non-footballer. Actually, I'm not, but that's another story. I'm not a non-Pole, for example. So, that language is problematic, but what could people do and what did they do? And people did various things. Gabriella herself spent time in a couple of convents, and eventually her grandmother arranged for her to go on a Kindertransport to this country. And she talks about that at length in her recording. I'm happy to share that recording with you because she's given me permission to do, but I won't be putting it up on the ATCRE website because I don't think it's just for anybody to come into, but if any of you want that, I'm more than happy to share it with you. There's an awful lot to it. And I'm going very briefly back to it just for a moment because I think her words are much better than mine. On Kristallnacht, her father was taken away. Her birthday was the next day. He was coming with the Grand to visit her. They didn't turn up and she never saw him again. She did find out many years later what had happened to him, and he is remembered, if you like, on a memorial stone in Vienna. I met with her last November. I took her out for lunch to a golf club actually up in the northeast. And she said, this week's really hard for me because it's Kristallnacht and it's my birthday and my family want to celebrate the fact that I'm 96. And I really find my birthday a day I don't want to celebrate at all. And it struck me that this woman was over 80 years later still, carrying that. And she, as she would say herself, she survived and her grandma did too. She came to this country and she ended up in a number of convents are a theme through. I think there's also a subtitle here, which is almost watch out for the nuns. She came to on Kindertransport, and she arrived in Harwich, and she was met by somebody from something else which we don't often hear about, which was the Catholic Refugee Committee at the time, who looked after children coming on Kindertransport, and who then took responsibility for their welfare and kept an eye on them during their time as children.
There were 2 or 3 of us met by this lady from the Catholic Committee for Refugees. She looked very kind, smiling and welcoming, but there was a big but. She couldn't speak German, and we, none of because they had been very kind to me, but the atmosphere
This is the
changed a
foster
little bit, I
parents.
think. I was maybe seen as the enemy, and the reason for the lady of the house, her husband having been sent away, and she didn't quite know where he had gone to. And, well, her treatment of me was not exactly kind. And so I think somebody must have realized that, because I didn't complain to anybody. I was just scared and sad. But somebody, evidently, I learned later, had gone to the school and told the headmistress that they thought, must have been neighbours, I think, and they told them that they thought I wasn't being treated as I should. And the head teacher knew that the Catholic Committee for Refugees had overall responsibility for me, and she informed them. And the lady who came down from London to Aldershot to see me came to the school and was absolutely astounded at how well I could communicate with her, because it was the same lady who couldn't communicate with me at all when she met me at Harwich. And I was asked questions, and the questions were very simple, and I answered them truthfully, and I was told I would be taken away and found another home. And shortly after Christmas that year, the same lady came down again to Aldershot, this time to the house where I lived, and she obviously had communicated with the lady of the house, and I had to pack my case and take my teddy and my belongings, and she took me to a school in Ashford in Kent, and it was another convent. I became another boarder in a convent school. It was the Sisters of Notre Dame. Several times during that day.
So, just to finish her story, unfortunately, you know, we've got to abbreviate it, but she ended up, during those years, she spent time in 5 convents. I think that's really interesting, and I don't think it's maybe a story that we know so much about the role of perhaps female religious. So she went from the Notre Dames then to St Vincent's in Mill Hill to the Daughters of Charity to train as a nursery nurse. And that was because she couldn't stay on at school after 16 because there was no funding for her. She eventually ended up training to be a teacher and as a head teacher in the North East. And I think was, from my knowledge of her, probably a brilliant teacher. So let's just bring this together, really. We have a number of examples, and I'm not for a minute suggesting that, you know, that we can kind of own the narrative of Holocaust, or that we can position the church as kind of, you know, the be-all and end-all of things. But I think it's interesting to discover perhaps and to be attentive to some of the stories and the aspects that we're not always familiar with. This anti-Semitism that led up to, or you know, created, I think, a culture, perhaps an environment in which Nazi ideology could thrive, was a persecution of a religious group, the Jews. The Nazis, with their Aryan ideology, were very much seeking to obliterate the Jewish race. So whether you were a practicing religious Jew or not was irrelevant. Edith Stein became a Catholic, great philosopher as you probably know. She was sent to Auschwitz as a Carmelite from Amsterdam, I think it was, and she was actually canonised. I have problems with that because she wasn't, I don't think, a Catholic martyr of the Holocaust. I think she was killed because she was Jewish, although Catholics were persecuted. And I think that's just important to remember, that a person's Jewishness wasn't obliterated by being a Catholic, although often it was a way of, I'm not suggesting in her case, but for some people it was a way of being hidden. And perhaps in some ways the church did stand up against, or did exercise its ability to resist by sometimes sheltering young people. With lots of different ways in which resistance happened, all of those worthy of consideration. There was a community of 11 sisters actually, who out of 12 who were murdered here and ended up in a mass grave in Poland. Again, not always a story that perhaps we're so aware of, and it's interesting to interweave with a narrative of course, Polish collaborators, the Polish government now, which won't have that said, and some of those very conflicted positions that people were in. And an order that's still thriving, and certainly is in the States today. You've probably come across the Scarlet Pimpernel. There's a lot of debate about the part the Vatican played, and Pius XII, to what extent was he silent? Was he in his silence working to actually save people? And there is evidence of a very mixed picture there, I think. But one of the people involved who certainly did smuggle and hide refugees was Hugh O'Flaherty. And again, there's a monument to him there, but it's an interesting, another interesting insight. John Dobie is another colleague, really, a survivor who gives his testimony, and he's very interesting because they were secular Jews, and in his presentation he shows a picture of himself dressed up in white for his first communion at a Catholic school. And that's because his parents, who weren't religious, decided the best way to help him to survive would be to enrol him in a Catholic school, and to do that after they had become Catholics. And so they were baptised, and he was hidden, if you like, in plain sight in that sense. I think for certainly at sort of sixth form and upper school level, that for me raises interesting issues about, is that honest? Is it honest to baptise people, give them baptismal certificates to save them? And there are really interesting ethical debates, I think, in some of that, in terms of, denying the person's identity, perhaps. But for what purpose? And I think very few people would say you shouldn't save life when you could. And priests taking huge risks to do that. So, you wonder, why have we got a picture of a shoe? On Tuesday I'll be going to Auschwitz, and one of the things I'll be aware of yet again as we arrive with sixth formers is we've got Auschwitz I, essentially for political prisoners, where Maximilian Kolbe died and others. And quite close by we've got the Carmelite monastery, we've got a cross, we've got all sorts of things which perhaps have happened, which indicate the difficult position perhaps that the church has in that contested space, and also how, for us, in a country that wasn't occupied, things are quite different. But one thing we can't deny is the individuals who were there, and this, I think, is a way of coming to an end, really. This is a shoe of one of those who arrived at Auschwitz, who may have survived, but most likely didn't, and if she did, she would have been very much, have suffered a great deal. And so I tend to pause just at the end of a session to remind us, your shoes are very individual. If you put somebody else's shoes on by accident, you know. And I think it's a good symbol for us of just the diversity of those who were victims of the Holocaust, their individualness. And a chance to just perhaps pause for a moment. They look to me like dance shoes, like a young person bought them, chose them to go dancing. And I want to give the final word to Gabriella because she has, she finishes with a prayer that she's written. And I'd just like to put that up for us to our family today, which is, I think, a lovely thing to see. So thank you for doing whatever I asked you to do. Thank you for that. Apologies for interrupting you so often. And I hope maybe there's just a few things there to think about a little bit more, because I believe Holocaust education has a part to play in RE, and I think there's lots of things our young people are really able to get into the teeth into. When I do the projects from Auschwitz, I can always nearly always identify the students from Catholic schools. That's because I know the schools. But I spoke to some recently at Newcastle Airport and I said, thank you for your contributions. You're really reflective, I said. And they told me which school they were in. And I said, I do notice that often Catholic school sixth formers have a great facility for that. And they said, well, you know what it is, they said, we do retreats and we reflect. We have to reflect, they said. We've done it for years. And I thought that was, quite an interesting insight. Anyway, there are also some links that might be useful that you might want to use, so they will be available for you.